Eden Live, where I am reading all of Eden by FREI live on Facebook and on YouTube, with the recorded clips then being posted to Instagram IGTV as well. There are only 3 more chapters in Volume 3 of Eden by FREI. Volume 3 is the Snowflake Collector. And this is chapter 10, which is called George. The moment he woke up the next morning, the Snowflake Collector had only one thought. George. That was his name. It would have to be. There was no other possibility. If he were still to be there, if the gel into which he had settled had not crushed him, or dried him out, or obliterated him, if he were still to be a snowflake today, then there was a chance, maybe a slim chance only, but a chance that he would still be a snowflake tomorrow. And if he were to be a snowflake tomorrow, still, there may be a chance that the method had worked, that this gel was the formula that he would be able to now apply. But time only would tell. Certainly, if he were to find him still there, where he left him on the kitchen table, then that would be a good sign. But it would be no more than that. And surely his name would have to be George. The Snowflake Collector got up from his narrow, hard bed and wandered slowly into the kitchen, a short distance that felt to him this morning eternally long. He did not want to cast his eyes over the table in the dim light that filtered through the small window. But before he could avert them, George had caught them, was calling them over to him. Look at me, I am here. The miracle was complete. Not only was he still there, he seemed to radiate, shine. Now, some 14 hours after he had come into contact with the peculiar liquid inside the glass cube that had caught him, enveloped him, slowed him, and then suspended him just precisely in time before he was able to sink to the bottom or dissolve, he seemed made of crystal indeed. It was quite extraordinary. The Snowflake Collector lifted the cube from the table and held it up against the pale light, in which particles of dust engaged in their strangely courteous dance, and the swell of joy welled up in his heart as he saw George is alive. He was as alive as any snowflake that wasn't engaged in its own dance still through the sky toward earth could possibly be. He was vivid and compelling. He had as much character as any inanimate thing the Snowflake Collector had ever seen, and he knew now, for certain, the Snowflake Collector, that this was not a thing without soul. This was George, the most exquisite snowflake ever formed in the world, perfectly captured by him. The gel, overnight, had solidified into a firm but not hard cast that was still absolutely transparent and that seemed to allow George to breathe. Of course, the Snowflake Collector knew in reality George did not breathe, and the cube was hermetically sealed, but it was a minimal malleability. It was a minimal malleability that seemed to keep George animated, if certainly no longer free. The Snowflake Collector put George down on the kitchen table and stepped outside his hut and wiped the thin layer of snow from the table that stood out there. And he found, as he knew he would, noted down the last set of proportions he had used, and he now copied them onto a piece of wood that he picked up from the ground and took them inside. This was the key. And it was unique. Not in the way he had heard on occasion some people call something unique when they meant it was simply special or well made or quite interesting. This was a thing that was one of a kind. No one else had found it before him, and maybe nobody else ever would, or would want to again. And it was far from certain that it would stand the test of time that now loomed before it. But for the time being, this was what he himself had achieved, and so far it was good. And if George were still to be there in October, or in November, or even December, whenever next the valley would be covered in snow, then he would apply this same formula to make the gel in which to preserve other snowflakes, and he would store them in a new sturdy case he would build to accommodate the new dimensions of these cubes. And if the following year, and the year after, all these snowflakes and George were still there, then he would be who he had decided to be, who he felt in his heart and knew in his mind he needed to be. He would become the Snowflake Collector, and János would be able to take pictures of these snowflakes with his macro lens that he had bought for his camera, and everything would be just so. After this short burst of snow in the middle of June, the valley soon reverted to summer, and the Snowflake Collector put George on his own in the new case that he'd built, and occasionally he would take him out to look at him in awe. János spent some time away, as sometimes he did this time of year, but when he came back to the Snowflake Collector's hut late in August, he found him in a hopeful mood and in good spirits. George was still there, and he hadn't lost any of his intricate beauty. The gel that had nearly hardened, but not quite, was still exactly as clear and still just a little flexible. It hadn't solidified any further, nor had it softened. It had simply stayed as it was, neither hard nor soft, neither wet nor dry, neither hot nor cold, but all of these all at once, and none of these all at the same time. The Snowflake Collector was ecstatic, quietly, inwardly so, as was his wont, at having, it seemed, found a way to preserve his snowflakes in their full 3 dimensions. But, of course, he was also worried and gravely concerned. What about their 4th dimension, he wondered, and 5th? Even as I name these snowflakes and know that they each have a soul, how can I do that soul justice? How can I trap a snowflake and pat myself on the back when I but caught it and barely scraped the surface of any understanding of what a snowflake truly is? János was unperturbed by all this. You'll get to know them, he said, in his simple, laconic tone that was never agitated and never bored. And as you get to know them, they will reveal to you their 4th dimension and 5th, and even if they have one, their 6th. This rang true with the Snowflake Collector, and he held the arm of János, the first time possibly he had ever done so, and said, "Thank you, János. I hope you are right." But what if he weren't right? What if what Janos had said was well-intentioned, but simply not true? There was no way of knowing. There was no way of anticipating. There was no way of solving this problem now. All the Snowflake Collector could do now, and for the remaining months of the year, until snow returned to the valley, whenever that should happen to be, was to look after George and prepare himself. For winter would come, and with it would come the moment of truth. And only then, come the moment of truth, could he really commence with his task that was quite immense. And that is it for today. I promised you I would show you the illustrations by Diego Cassia in the illustrated edition of the Snowflake Collector. But in this chapter, in chapter 10, there are none. And so we will have to wait until the penultimate of 12 chapters in the Snowflake Collector, chapter 11, for our next illustration. And this will happen very soon. It will happen on Monday, today being Wednesday. So I hope I'll see you again on Monday at 6 p.m. London time, 1 p.m. EST. And until then, take very good care of yourselves. Stay safe and sane in these still crazy circumstances. And love and let love, and see you very soon. Bye-bye.